Hello, class, and welcome back to our discussion of early America and the antebellum period. This is going to be the last video for this section. This video might be a little bit long, but I didn't want to break it into two videos. But I'll try to keep it as concise as I can. So, the last thing we talked about was the Mexican-American War. And I mentioned that the big debate after that war would be, what to do with the new territory in terms of, are those going to be slave states or free states? And so before the war is even over, while the war is still happening, a congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot proposed a ban on slavery in those territories, right? What we call the Mexican cession. So everything west of Texas over to California. This was able to pass in the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate. The reason for that, okay, so the House of Representatives, if you remember, is based on population. So clearly the northern states where we have this industry and there's a lot of immigration to the north has much more people than the South. So in the House of Representatives, the North has the advantage because of population. But during this time, the South has the advantage in the Senate because of having more states. We talked about Florida and Texas. And so the Wilmot Proviso is struck down in the Senate, does not pass, but it sort of demonstrates the sectional division that has happened where, now we clearly have two halves of the nation divided, and particularly over the issue of spreading slavery to the west, to more states. Another thing that happens right after the Mexican-American War is the California Gold Rush. So gold is discovered in California in January of '48. So right as the war ends. Now this is good for the American economy. It obviously is going to, it's a lot of wealth there. But it's going to cause large migrations of people to California from the eastern half of the country and from other countries. So we get people from China, people from Latin America coming in. This displaces a lot of the native population of California, so the American Indians who live there, also the Californios, the Mexican population that lives in California. It also, because of the large numbers of people flooding into California, it pushes California into statehood. Typically territories in American history, in our story of American history, we've been expanding east to west. And normally there's a transitional period where an area would be a territory for a while and then eventually becomes a state. California upsets that whole system because California skips the middle, right? California is on the west coast. So all that land in the middle, everything from like Kansas to Wyoming and Montana, like all of that territory is now passed over for settlement in California. So California is ready to be a state. And so the issue of whether or not California is going to be a slave state is pushed to the forefront of Congress. And as we've seen, this is now the hotly debated issue. This is the issue that is being debated in Congress. It is the issue of, will slavery spread to more states? In '48, that's also an election year, and we're going to get a new president elected in '48. So that'll be Zachary Taylor, and you should remember Zachary Taylor from our last video. He is a hero of the Mexican-American War. He was one of those commanding generals who led an invasion, from Texas into Mexico. Pretty popular guy. He is elected. He will serve less than one term. So he's going to die in office. He's the second president to die in office, which, shows the Whig party's having bad luck because so far we've had two, we had William Henry Harrison was a Whig. He died 30 days in office, 31 days in office. and then was replaced by Tyler as vice president, who the Whigs ended up sort of kicking out of the party. So now Taylor gets elected as a Whig, and he dies a little over a year after taking office. And so he's not able to accomplish much as president. He obviously, has to deal with this sectional crisis, this debate over what's going to happen with this slave territory, or this new territory. Is it going to be slave territory or free territory? But one thing that we do want to mention about Taylor is that he expands the executive branch. So the Department of the Interior is created. So now we have the Department of War, the Department of State, the Department of Justice, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of the Interior. Okay, so obviously after his death, his vice president is going to take over, and that will be Millard Fillmore. So Millard Fillmore will be our third or fourth Whig. We're going to call him the fourth Whig. So we're going to, say Harrison and then Tyler, and then Taylor, and now Fillmore would be the fourth Whig president, and he will also be the last Whig president. So we have we never have a Whig party president who serves even one full term, because he's obviously taken over after Taylor, and he won't be reelected. So he's going to serve less than one term. The most important thing that happens as far as Fillmore's presidency goes is the Compromise of 1850, and we'll take a closer look at that. So the Compromise of 1850 is introduced by Henry Clay. Remember Henry Clay? We've talked about Henry Clay for a long time. He was one of the war hawks, and he was a Democratic Republican, and then he was a National Republican, and then he was a Whig. And he is one of the guys who, he's sort of the founder of the American system. And he wrote the Compromise of 1820, which is the Missouri Compromise. And now he's introducing this Compromise of 1850. How do we resolve this sectional crisis, this arguing between the North and the South over this new territory in the West? And so he has this compromise, and at first nobody likes it. And he actually he's pretty old at this point. He's unhealthy. He's got some health problems with tuberculosis. And he ends up leaving office. And his compromise that he authors, the Compromise of 1850, ends up getting pushed through with the help of Millard Fillmore and Stephen Douglas. And we'll talk more about Stephen Douglas later. But basically, the Compromise of 1850 is 5 parts. There's 5 parts to it. In fact, it's introduced as 5 separate bills when it passes. So one of the 5 points of this compromise is that California will be admitted as a free state. So as we just mentioned, California, that boom of population because of the gold rush, it's ready to become a state. There's a big debate over, is it going to be a free state or a slave state? And the answer is California will be admitted to the Union as a free state. All right. So another part, I guess we could call it part 2, is Texas will actually lose a lot of territory. So, obviously Texas is a very big state, but when the Mexican War ended, Texas actually claimed a whole lot of land. They claimed everything north and west of, they claimed all this territory. And so the federal government, as part of this compromise, convinces Texas to give up all of that extra land that it's claimed in exchange for having its debts assumed by the federal government. So remember, the state of Texas was the Republic of Texas at one time, and it had a lot of debt. And so the federal government's basically saying, hey, we'll take care of your debt if you will give up all of this extra land that you've claimed after the war. And we'll talk about what happens to that land in a minute. So another part of the compromise is that the slave trade is banned in Washington, D.C. And I don't want anyone to misunderstand this. Slave owners can still have slaves in Washington, D.C., but the trade of slaves is what's banned, okay? Now, another part is New Mexico and Utah territories. So basically, Texas gives up this extra land that it's claimed, and so now there's a large section of land between Texas and California. Basically, they're going to split that into a northern half and a southern half. And so the southern half will be the New Mexico territory, the northern half will be the Utah territory, and more importantly, the compromise says that the issue of slavery in those territories will be decided by popular sovereignty. So in other words, Congress will not decide whether Utah or New Mexico are slave territories. It will be up to the people in those territories to decide for themselves. And then finally, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So this basically made it illegal to assist with runaway slaves, right? So it made helping slaves run away illegal. It also made if you had knowledge of runaway slaves or something assisting runaway slaves, that would be illegal. So it made it harder for slaves to run away. And I want to mention this here. A lot of people mistakenly think that when slaves ran away, they were running to the northern states. That's not accurate. They were running to the northern states, but they were more accurately running through the northern states. The slaves that ran away were trying to get to Canada if they really wanted safety, because by the U.S. laws here, like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, running away to a northern state, if they were captured, they would just be sent back. So I wanted to make that point clear. All right, so 1852, we get a new president. This is Franklin Pierce. He's an interesting case here because he's a Democrat. As we know, Democrats are pro-slavery and they are pro-expansion, and we will see that with him. But he is from New England. So, there's a mischaracterization in American history that all of the pro-slavery people were in the South. But that's not the case. This guy's from the North, but he's a Democrat. He supports slavery and supports expansion, which we've talked about how those things go together. So a couple of things that'll happen with him, the Gadsden Purchase, which we'll talk about, and then we'll see Cuba and Japan related to his presidency. And this all goes back to the idea of expansion, the Democrats being pro-expansion, manifest destiny, those kind of things. And then probably most importantly is this thing called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we'll talk about as well. Right, so the Gadsden Purchase. This is basically the U.S. is going to buy that, what you see on the map there in yellow. The U.S. is going to buy that from Mexico for $10 million. So 29.5 million square miles, parts of Arizona, New Mexico. This is obviously expansionist, but it wasn't, in the relative scale of the United States, it's not that big. But this does bring us to our current borders of the United States. So the map of the U.S. will now look like we know it to look, not on the inside, not where the states are, but on the outside of the United States. And then we have this thing called the Austin Manifesto. This was a desire on the part of Democrats to annex Cuba. Obviously, Cuba is pretty, big island off the coast of Florida, south of Florida. The idea here was that the U.S. would try to purchase this from Spain, and if Spain didn't give it to us, then we would go to war with Spain. The Whigs, particularly the anti-slavery Whigs, remember the Whigs is a pretty diverse party. They got a lot of irons in the fire. But the anti-slavery Whigs sort of shot this down because they believed that the U.S. annexation of Cuba was really just a way to expand slavery and essentially create a new slave state. So that didn't happen. One thing that did happen, though, under the Pierce administration was the Perry expeditions. So this was two naval expeditions. In fact, the first one actually left under President Fillmore, but two expeditions to the Far East under a U.S. naval officer named Matthew Perry. And he winds up in Japan. And during this time, Japan is ruled by, this is when you think of feudal Japan, so the samurais and the shogun and things like that. That's during this period. So Japan is ruled by a man called the shogun. So this is during the Tokugawa shogunate. And Japan had, during the earlier period of exploration, so when you think back to, the section 1 of this course, right, when we were talking about the age of exploration. During that time period, the Tokugawa shogunate had closed itself off. It closed Japan off. Basically, it didn't want outsider influence, and so it had sealed itself off from outsiders. But when Perry rolls up here in his boats in the mid 1800s, he's going to use what has been termed gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy is basically this, it's the practice of these Western industrialized powers. So think France, think England, think the United States, having these superior technological warcraft, so the steamboats, right? We have steamboats, we have these, modern artillery pieces for the time. And so just like Britain was able to force unequal treaties with China, as we sort of mentioned earlier, the U.S. is going to do that with Japan. So Perry is credited with opening diplomatic and economic relations with Japan, but he does do that at the threat of a warship. 1852, a novel is published. So, the same year that Franklin Pierce is elected, a novel gets published called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this novel was written by a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And her maiden name there, Beecher, should sound familiar because we talked in a previous video about Lyman Beecher. And remember, Lyman Beecher was a pastor during the Second Great Awakening. He was an outspoken minister against alcohol, and we talked about that. But he was also against slavery, and this was during that time where religious institutions were fracturing along social lines. So you had churches splitting over the issue of slavery. And obviously, Beecher's from the North, and so his family is religious, but they're against slavery. And so as his daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she writes this novel, this is a novel written to sort of expose the horrors of slavery. She writes this book and it gets published, and it's a bestseller. It's a best-selling novel of the 19th century. And what's interesting about this book, so it's told from the perspective of a slave. So it lets people sort of see through the eyes of a slave, even if they've never really experienced the institution firsthand. So it would get people who were sort of neutral on the issue maybe to pick a side, and obviously the book is designed to get you to side with the abolitionist movement. But what's interesting about this book is the main character, Tom. He's not always treated badly. In fact, he has various masters throughout the book, and some treat him kindly. But the point is to show that it doesn't matter if you have the best case scenario or the worst case scenario, whether you have a kind master or an abusive master. The fact is you still have a master, that a human being is owned by another human. And that's really what she's, showing. And so it helps popularize the abolitionist movement. Remember, the abolition movement was not about limiting the expansion of slavery. The abolitionist movement was about ending slavery. And so because this popularizes the movement, a lot of people read this book. It's the hottest thing, out there in pop culture that at that time. and people are influenced by it. And so what it's going to happen is it's going to bring the abolitionist movement to the forefront. All right, it's going to go from being sort of a fringe movement to being the main movement in the North. All right, so a couple years later, we're going to have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, this is significant. So this is during the Pierce administration. And so basically, we have a Democrat from Illinois, so a Northern Democrat, named Stephen Douglas, who wants to build a transcontinental railroad through his state. All right. So the U.S. government has already decided that they're going to build this railroad. We need to connect the East, which is where most of our infrastructure is, to California, which is where all of this gold is. So we need to connect our western state of California to the rest of the states back east. And so obviously at the time, you would have to take a wagon. It would be very slow moving. You could take a ship around South America. But a train would expedite that. And so everybody is in agreement that we need a train that goes across the country. What they disagree on is where the train will go, because wherever that train goes, east to west, you're going to get a lot of economic growth. So southern states want it to go through the south, northern states want it to go through the north. And so Stephen Douglas, he's in the north, but he's a Democrat. And so he's not against expansion, he's not against slavery, and he's saying, you know, I really want this railroad to go through my state, and most northern states would agree with that because they would benefit from it. But how do I get the South to agree to have a railroad go through my state, which would be in the north? You know, how would I get the South to vote yes on this going through the north? And so, you know, what is it that the South desires? Well, they want to, you know, expand their lifestyle. And so he comes up with a plan where he says, okay, the railroad will go through the north, and it'll go through these northern states, including Illinois, which is his state. And as it continues west into the Great Plains, it will create two new territories. Obviously, those two new territories will be Kansas and Nebraska. But here's where it gets catchy, because he says these new territories will get to decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty. So in other words, Kansas could vote to be a free state, or it could vote to be a slave state. Obviously, this is creating the potential for a new slave state, which the South would like and they would support. But it would also undo the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise said no new slave states above this line. And so it does both those things. It opens the door to slavery in Kansas and Nebraska, technically, but it also repeals the Missouri Compromise. Now, you see a name there, Andrew Butler. Andrew Butler is from South Carolina. So Andrew Butler is going to co-sponsor this bill. So Douglas comes up with this bill, but Butler co-sponsors it because he needs a Southern guy to get support to get the other Southern states on board. So this passes, all right? This passes. We're going to see both of these guys' names again, too. So they're introduced here, but we'll see them again. All right, so obviously this is going to make the anti-slavery people very upset. So this Kansas-Nebraska Act is really the catalyst that forms a new political party. So we're going to now have, in 1854, the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is created in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's created in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So basically, this is going to pull in a lot of the Whigs. So a lot of the Whigs will now become the Republican Party. There was also a party called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was very small. It never had a whole lot of support. Its whole platform was limiting the expansion of slavery. And so these two parties are going to form the Republican Party, which is built on the idea of being an anti-slavery party. The Republican Party is an anti-slavery party. And I want to repeat that because so many people today, they get this confused. And none of this is meant to affect any of your politics today, okay? We're talking about the 1800s. But in the 1800s, the Republican Party is created as an anti-slavery party. They are against slavery. They also advocate for the industrial development and economic modernization. And again, those things go together. Slavery and industry can't coexist. So getting rid of slavery and welcoming industry goes together. Now there's a picture here, and obviously this picture is problematic, right? There's some problems looking at a picture like this, but this is a campaign poster from this time period. And I want to point out, if you look, it says the Democratic platform is for the white man. And then it says the Republican platform is for the Negro, okay? Obviously the artist, all right, purposely drew these two characters in different lights. They're represented differently. So if based on that language, okay, so based on the artistry, right, how do the two people look in the picture? But then think about the language. It says the Democratic platform is for the white man, the Republican platform is for the Negro. You have to remember who can actually vote, right? Who can vote? Well, white men can vote. So this is a Democratic Party poster, right? This is a poster trying to get you to vote Democrat, okay? Again, this has nothing to do with whatever election year we're in listening to this. At least I hope it doesn't. All right, we're talking about the 1850s and 1860s right here when we're talking about this, okay? But this is the Republican Party. So we now have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the two parties that we are familiar with. This is those parties. Also, as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we're going to have something that becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And basically, this is a civil war that happens in Kansas between anti-slavery settlers and pro-slavery settlers. Remember, Kansas, the issue is unsettled. It's going to be decided by a vote, by popular sovereignty. And so you have, people migrating into Kansas from both areas, from slave states and from free states, and they end up killing each other. Okay, so the free staters are the anti-slavery faction, and the border ruffians is what they call the pro-slavery faction. And again, it's civil unrest, right? There's murders, there's riots, there's all kind of crazy stuff that happens. But there's a name there, John Brown. John Brown is one of the anti-slavery free staters, and he's going to lead some attacks against some of the pro-slavery settlers and even kill some. He's going to kill people, and he's going to do that in the name of being an abolitionist sent by God. This guy, John Brown, he believes that he is an instrument of God sent to end slavery. And we're introducing him here, but he's going to play a much bigger role in something we're going to talk about later. So don't forget his name either. All right, so the Brooks-Sumner Affair. All right, Brooks-Sumner Affair, 1856. So you're going to hear a name you heard just a minute ago. All right, so here we have a Republican senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner. So remember, Republicans are anti-slavery. He's from Massachusetts, so he's from the North, but he is giving a speech. He's giving a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And what he's referring to is this Bleeding Kansas situation that we just talked about. And in his speech, he is bashing two men, all right? He's bashing Stephen Douglas, who authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he's bashing Andrew Butler. Remember, that was the Southern guy that supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So he's really going after Douglas, and he's going after Butler. But there's a problem. At the time that he's doing this, Butler is not present. Andrew Butler has had a stroke. He's in bad health. And so he's not present because of his health. And so Southerners, for one, they don't like what Charles Sumner's saying, but they don't think it's right that he is verbally assaulting the character of Andrew Butler, who cannot defend himself. But there is another South Carolinian there named Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks from South Carolina, he's a Democrat. He's also Andrew Butler's cousin. So Preston Brooks is listening to a man that's bad-mouthing his state and his cousin who can't defend himself because he's had this stroke and he's not there. And Preston Brooks becomes irritated with it, and he decides that he's going to do something about it, and he beats Charles Sumner with his walking stick, with a cane, and he almost kills him. He beats Charles Sumner so bad he permanently handicaps him. He almost dies. This is, they are literally, he's literally assaulting a person on the floor of Congress. And it shows that things have been pushed to the point, this sectional crisis has been pushed to the point of, there's almost no further reasonable discourse. They can't talk about it anymore. They're too divided to have a conversation at this point. So 1856, another president comes along, James Buchanan, another Democrat. By the way, another Northern Democrat. He's from Pennsylvania. But he gets elected. He's only going to serve one term. In fact, he promised that he would only serve one term. He probably wouldn't have had a choice. He is normally considered, and when they rank the presidents, he's considered one of the worst because of what happens during his presidency. We'll talk about it. You'll notice down here at the bottom, normally it says a few key things about like their presidency. He doesn't have any. That's because he's criticized for not doing anything. That's really the problem with Buchanan. And we'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So he's elected in 56. This is an interesting election because this was the first presidential election that had a Republican, right? Because the Republican Party was just created in 54. So Buchanan defeats John C. Fremont, the first Republican presidential candidate. And remember, we've heard his name before because he was in the Mexican-American War. He was in California, signed the Treaty of Cahuenga. So he's a war hero and in governor of California. What's interesting about Fremont is he grew up in the South. He grew up in the Southern plantation society. That's why he went to military school and became a military officer. Now he wasn't part of the family of the plantation society. There's a little bit of a scandal involved in his birth. His father was basically his mother's French tutor that her rich husband had hired to teach her French. And so, there's an adulterous affair that happens. But he goes to military school and becomes a military leader. And now he's the, governor of California running for president. And he doesn't win. So first Republican presidential candidate, unsuccessful. But Buchanan also defeated Millard Fillmore. So this was a three-party election. Fillmore ran with the Know Nothing Party, and we've talked about that before. That was the anti-immigration party when we talked about nativism and stuff. So he not only defeats the first Republican presidential candidate, but he defeats a former president. All right, so he's elected, I guess, with a lot of hope. But as I said before, he's not remembered fondly by historians. These two things are here just to mention briefly some things that are happening when he becomes president. So one is the Third Seminole War. We talked a little bit about the First and Second Seminole War. The third one is basically just to wrap that up. Basically, this is in Florida. The last of the Seminoles are rounded up and sent west, though not really, because there's still Seminoles hiding out in the Everglades and stuff like that. But this is really the end of the Seminole War. And then the Utah War. This was a war between the United States and the Mormons in Utah, and it also just sort of fizzles out and ends. as a result of this, Brigham Young is replaced as governor, but for the most part, Mormons are given amnesty if they agree to submit to the authority of the U.S. federal government. So, two interesting little things that are happening there during the Buchanan administration. But the main thing we're worried about during the Buchanan administration is what's happening with our country. Our country's tearing itself apart. We got settlers in Kansas killing each other, and we got congressmen beating other congressmen with canes. And so everyone's looking to Buchanan, hey, what are you going to do about it? But we have a Supreme Court case. All right, this case is one of the most important cases that you'll learn about in American history. It is the most important case in terms of anything to do with slavery. And it happens with early into Buchanan's presidency. And so some people have said this is why Buchanan doesn't do anything, but we'll look at it. So Dred Scott v. Sanford. So the story here, Dred Scott was a slave. All right, he was in Missouri as a slave, and his master moved north. Okay, they moved to Illinois, and from there they moved to Wisconsin, and then eventually they moved back to Missouri. And Dred Scott said, well, I'm not a slave anymore. I'm a free man because I lived in a free state where we don't have slaves, and so therefore I'm free. And they said, no, you're not. And so he sued for his freedom, and it went through the district court, and eventually it made it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, ruled against Dred Scott. And so the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, gave the opinion. And here's what it said. This is why it's important. Remember, it's not the facts of the case that are important. It's the ruling. And here's what Chief Justice Taney said. He basically said that Dred Scott couldn't sue for his freedom because blacks were not American citizens. And if they're not American citizens, then they don't have the same rights and privileges afforded in the Constitution to everybody else that are citizens. And so basically his ruling is that blacks are not American citizens. Okay, that's important. More importantly is he says that Congress had no constitutional authority to restrict the expansion of slavery. In other words, the whole reason that Dred Scott said, I was in a slave state and then we moved to a free state, all of that was based on the Missouri Compromise. And Chief Justice Taney says Congress didn't have the authority to decide where slavery could go and where it couldn't. That was a state issue. It wasn't up to the U.S. Congress to decide that. And so basically, even though the Missouri Compromise has been repealed at this point, he's basically saying that was unconstitutional. And so any state that was decided to be a free state or a slave state based on that compromise, that doesn't matter. And so Buchanan thinks that he doesn't have anything to worry about anymore, that the sectional crisis is now over because the Supreme Court has now ruled that slavery is a state issue. And so he thinks, hey, I don't have to worry about that anymore. And some people have said that's why he's complacent. But the problem only is going to get worse. All right. So October of 1859, here's that name John Brown again. So we talked about him in Bleeding, Kansas. He was killing people in Kansas. But he has now decided, remember, he thinks he's God's instrument to end slavery. He is a radical abolitionist. And so he comes up with a plan to raid a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So a place where the U.S. government has, muskets stored for war. He's going to raid that arsenal, and basically they're going to take those muskets and use those to arm slaves, and he's going to lead a slave rebellion. And so that's what he does. Brown and his followers, which consist of some of his white followers and some black followers, they go to raid the federal arsenal. Obviously, the federal government has to respond to this. And in fact, there's an operation commanded by Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is a hero of the Mexican-American War. He's a U.S. Army officer who's tasked with putting down this raid. And if you don't know who Robert E. Lee is, he's going to be very important when we get to the next section, which will be about the American Civil War. But Brown is captured, his followers are captured, and then we have a case, Virginia v. John Brown, where he is tried for treason, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection. He is found guilty of all charges and hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Now, John Brown has become a divisive figure. There was a point in time where, people would have said, hey, this guy's a criminal. But because of the divisive nature of what was happening and the fact that Brown was an abolitionist, a lot of people came to see him as a hero and as a martyr. Obviously he broke laws, but, people who agree that slavery is bad have seen this guy as sort of a champion for human rights. So it's a divisive issue. All right. Now that brings us to the election of 1860. All right, election of 1860, we have 4 candidates. So the election is split 4 ways. And every time that happens in American history, it usually leads to some pretty crazy stuff. It's pretty interesting results when we have, more than 2 candidates. So we have Abraham Lincoln, who is the Republican, right? We know the Republican is the anti-slavery, pro-modernization party. He's from Illinois, which is a northern state, a free state. Then we have John Breckinridge, which is a Democrat from Kentucky. Kentucky is considered a southern state during this time, pro-slavery candidate. And then we have Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is also a Democrat. He's a northern Democrat, so he's from Illinois. He's from the same state as Lincoln. And so, obviously that's going to cause problems with the Democrat vote, and we'll see how that plays out. And then we have this guy, John Bale. John Bale is from a party called the Constitutional Union Party, which basically, wants to follow the Constitution and keep the Union together. But he's from a southern state. He's from Tennessee. So you're going to get Southerners who could potentially vote for that party because they don't want to see the country torn apart. You might get Southerners who vote for Breckinridge because they're pro-slavery and they want to protect that. You might get Northerners who vote for Douglas because they're Democrats, and then you might get Northerners who vote for Lincoln. And so let's see what happens. So we have the election, and so if you look at this election map, you see 4 colors. I mean, technically you see 5 because you see the territories, but as far as states go, you see 4 colors, 4 candidates, 4 colors. All right, well, the Republicans win, which is Abraham Lincoln, and you probably already know that. Abraham Lincoln wins the election of 1860. But look at the popular vote. Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote. All right, that means 60% of the nation did not vote for Lincoln. Okay, now we've had presidents win without winning the popular vote, but maybe it's 49%, maybe 48%, 40%, meaning 60% of the country didn't vote for him. That's pretty significant. Okay, but he wins the electoral vote, and we know that's what really matters. But how? How does he win the electoral vote? Well, let's look at the map. All right, so the red states there are Lincoln. All right, notice he only won free states. He only won free states. All right, not a single slave state voted for Lincoln, which makes sense because Lincoln's anti-slavery candidate. All right, but what happened to our slave states? Well, we've got some of them voting for Breckinridge. He's represented by the green. All right, so you see those green states, those all voted for Breckinridge. We got a few slave states voting for John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, which is also interesting because it's not one of the 2 major parties, but it wins, a few states. That rarely happens. And then look at Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas only wins 1 state. Okay, Stephen Douglas wins Missouri, and that's it. But let's look at those numbers again. Okay, Stephen Douglas wins 1 state, Missouri. But look at the percentages on the popular vote. He got more than Breckinridge and Bell. Okay? So what really happens is the Democratic vote, a lot of people voted for Douglas, but he didn't win. You know, these things get divided, right? The percentages, people win states, they win the electors from that state. And so Lincoln, right? Lincoln wins the electoral vote just by winning northern states because all the other states are divided. And remember, the Electoral College is based on population. It's representation based on population. The more people live in your state, the more electors you have. And we've already seen how that favors the North because of the immigration. So a lot of Southerners would look at this map and they would say, something's not right here. Something's wrong. How did Lincoln win the election? All right, now we know how because we can do the math and see, okay, well, there's more electoral votes in the North because of representation based on population, and then the South divided their vote too much. But at the time when people were so hotly divided and clouded by that division, they can't comprehend, hey, how did Lincoln win? All right, so what they feel is that the Constitution no longer works for them. It doesn't work in their favor anymore. And so in 7 southern states, they're going to pass ordinances of secession. All right. They believe Lincoln, coming in as a Republican, as an anti-slavery president, would be a direct threat to their economy, to their social, ladder. And so, based on the social issues and the economic issues, the cultural issues, and the political issues, because the way the Electoral College balanced out and all that, they said, hey, this isn't working for us anymore. So these 7 states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, they all passed ordinances of secession. All right, now I want to talk about that for just a second, okay? We're basically done with the section, but I need to discuss this, okay? Those 7 states, and this isn't meant to be divisive, it's not meant to be controversial, it's just stating historical fact, okay? Those 7 states voted to leave the Union at the state level. The states themselves, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, at the state level, they had state conventions, secession conventions, where they voted to leave the United States. Okay? Now, that right there is why we have a civil war. All right? Now, I'm not saying that slavery doesn't matter. Slavery does matter. These states probably wouldn't have left the Union had they not been concerned about, slavery and Lincoln being anti-slavery. But the reason that there's an actual war is because they left the Union. All right? That's why we're going to have the war, which we'll talk about later in the next section. The reason we have the war is because they left the Union. The point that I want to bring up is the way they left the Union is the exact same way they entered the Union. If you go back to when we talked about the Constitution and the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, all right, the states had ratification conventions where the states voted to either enter the Union or not enter the Union, right? And we went through, remember we needed 9 out of 13 and we went through them in order and eventually we got all 13. So the same way the states entered the Union, they are now leaving the Union. They're having a state convention and they go, here's why we're leaving the Union, and they voted on it and it passed. And so they're leaving the Union, all right? Metaphorically, they're saying we came in through this door, now we're going out through this door, okay? The problem is that in the North, there is a prominent idea that once you enter the Union, you can't not leave the Union. And that's why we have a war. All right. Now, we just talked about Lincoln being elected, but you have to remember the president at this time is Buchanan. Lincoln won't become president until, March of 61. So Buchanan's still the president. And this is where everybody looks to Buchanan like, what are you going to do? And Buchanan doesn't do anything. Buchanan makes a comment. He says that he doesn't think the states have the right to leave the Union. So Buchanan agrees with the North by saying, yeah, they're not allowed to do that. But he also says, but there's nothing we can do about it. So Buchanan, he just sort of washes his hands of it. He says, yeah, I'm not sure they're allowed to do that, but there ain't nothing we can really do about it now. And so he doesn't do anything. And he is what we call a lame duck president. That's not an attack on him. That's any president who is going out, they're done, is what we call a lame duck president. They don't normally, do a lot of policy because it's like, what's the point? But a lot of people here would say, hey, Buchanan, you didn't do anything to fix any of these problems. And now look what's happened. The nation has tore itself in half. All right. Now, when those 7 states left the Union, they all formed independent republics. So you had the Republic of South Carolina, the Republic of Mississippi, the Republic of Georgia, the Republic of Texas, right? But then they joined together, all right, February of 1861. They joined together under a new constitution and created a confederacy. All right, now we ought to know what a confederacy is because we learned about the Iroquois Confederacy. We talked about when the United States was a confederacy back under the Articles of Confederation, right? Where the idea was that the state had the power and there was a sort of national glue that held them together. So that's really what the Confederacy is doing here is they're saying, hey, we're maintaining our state autonomy, our state sovereignty, but we're going to be united together in that. And so they create this Confederate States of America, and they elect a president under this new government, and his name is Jefferson Davis. And you should know him because we learned about him in the Mexican-American War. He's a war hero. He's also served as the Secretary of War. So he's been in the presidential cabinet as Secretary of War. But now he is the president of the Confederacy, and that is where we're going to end. So this section is done, right? We started with 1800 with Jefferson, and Jefferson becoming president, and Jeffersonian democracy, and all this new hope for the new nation. And here we are 60 years later, and it's broken. It tore in half, and it's crazy because we think, man, it's a long section. We covered a lot. But that's only 60 years. 60 years is all we've covered. And the nation is now split in half. And so the next thing we'll talk about, obviously, will be the Civil War. And then Reconstruction, which is us trying to put this country back together once that war is over. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. The next section will obviously probably be very controversial. But it is. I mean, history is controversial. If history is not controversial, you're not studying real history. So we'll finish this section here, and our next section will be about the Civil War. All right, thank you.